Well, I was reading an interesting story in The Hill today. Apparently, there is a high number of vacancies within the Pentagon bureaucracy, and throughout the Trump administration now, there seems to be a lot of, at any given time, a lot of empty positions. I had heard this in the past about the State Department, which is understandable because the State Department is full of, very haughty types of people who, generally speaking, would not be Trump voters. Really, anyone the pool of people who would work in the State Department would be the kinds of folks who would always turn their nose up at someone like Trump. Now, you wouldn't expect that as much, however, from the Defense Department, because at least the military itself is relatively pro-Trump if you look at how they voted. The military voted overwhelmingly in favor of Trump over Hillary. But it makes a little more sense when you look closer at who staffs the Pentagon bureaucracy. The Pentagon is a massive organization. Obviously, just the Pentagon itself, the building, is a massive building with lots and lots of people working there. And the kinds of folks that they're having trouble procuring are the civilian bureaucrats, the kinds of folks who come out of, the international relations program at Georgetown and places like that. These are the not academics, but the intellectuals. In other words, they're the same kind of people who staff the State Department. So now, once you look into it, it makes sense that they have a very similar situation here that they do at the State Department. And of course, this is fundamentally kind of a positive thing, because you have all these terrible, awful people who don't want to work in government, which is great. They're giving up their own power. Unfortunately, the Trump administration doesn't seem to understand that's what their problem is that they are trying to hire all these people who stand against everything that Trump ran on. Now, maybe Trump just doesn't care about his campaign promises, but if you look at how he ran on being a non-interventionist and on pulling the troops out, well, of course, the Pentagon bureaucracy would hate that, because the Pentagon bureaucracy is all about planning to invade more places, and they see themselves as these great liberators. They're kind of it's kind of like playing a game for them. Since they are, of course, not the actual soldiers out fighting and dying in the fields, they are not any of the civilians in these Middle East countries getting massacred. So when Trump talks about, essentially ending their game and closing up shop and saying, "Okay, boys, it's time to pick up your toys and go home," well, you're going to get a lot of resentment for that. And so it makes sense then that when you actually do get into office that you would staff the bureaucracy not with those same establishmentarians, the folks who have been along for the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, and perhaps even the first Bush administration and the Reagan administration before that, who have essentially been the architects and the engineers of these horrible foreign policies. Rather, you would think that you'd bring in, outsiders or dissidents, even if those are dissidents from within the Pentagon. But apparently Trump just doesn't seem to know these people exist, that there are people who agree with the message that he actually ran on. I've heard this complained a lot about by, people who would be pretty well qualified to work in the Pentagon under Trump, who happen to agree with him. They say, "Hey, I haven't gotten any calls from the president." Who is it that he keeps calling? Folks like John Bolton, people who are the exact opposite of everything he ever ran on. And of course, it's not just John Bolton. We see John Bolton because, even though he's gone now, but we saw him because he was the national security advisor. But this happens up and down the Pentagon ladder, because there are countless, apparently, presidential appointed positions within the Pentagon. So many that they are being vacated faster than Trump can appoint new ones. And again, why are these people leaving? Well, they're leaving because they're frustrated because they don't really like Trump. And so they're there, because they wanted the job. But then they decide, what, I can't really do what I want here. I'm not, I don't really like this guy. I've got this on my resume now that I was the deputy undersecretary for whatever, some such nonsensical cause. And so I've clicked that, I've checked that box on my resume, and so now I'm going to get out. And so while it is pretty bad that Trump is not appointing people who will actually carry through what he campaigned on, what he promised to his voters, he's very clearly betraying his voters by appointing these people, at least they don't feel like Trump is malleable enough. Even though I think he's been quite malleable, the bureaucracy doesn't feel like they can manipulate Trump and to still accomplish their goals under his administration. They obviously don't feel like they're getting anything positive done that they would want to accomplish, or else they would be staying in those positions. So it's great that these people are leaving. It's just too bad that Trump hasn't figured that out, why that is yet, and why he's not taking advantage of that. In fact, this Hill story mentions how the administration is struggling because they're pulling from such a shallow bench of people who are even willing to interview for the job, because most of these so-called national security experts were big never-Trumpers. Why were they never-Trumpers? Because Trump said, hey, let's let Russia fight Al-Qaeda in Syria, or ISIS, or whatever, same thing. And hey, maybe we shouldn't get involved in any more dumb wars. Well, that's these guys' bread and butter. That's what they do. I mean, their whole lives are dumb wars. That is, what that's what they hang their hat on, to the extent that they even own any hats. Now, for this story, they interviewed Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who I believe is on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So he's one of the guys that would have to confirm all these new positions. And he was very upset that, all these folks are leaving and that Trump can't hang on to talent. And he's said, oh my gosh, the Pentagon's dysfunctional and it's being hollowed out. Well, and he's talking about this like, oh, this is so terrible. It's like, well, no. These are the people who are responsible for getting us into trouble over the past few decades. These are the folks who, had the idea of arming Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union, of empowering Al-Qaeda, who then came right back around after the Soviet Union collapsed and said, hey, let's go bomb America. It was pretty quick. After 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1993, I think it was, you had the first World Trade Center bombing. And of course, their motivation wasn't that, hey, we're mad that you helped give us money back in the 70s and 80s. It was more like, hey, we don't like America or Russia, and thanks, America, for helping us defeat Russia, but now we're going to come after you and do the exact same thing. And even though the first World Trade Center bombing wasn't successful, of course the 9/11 attacks were. And what was the big response of the Defense Department back then? And again, I get that they were that they were technically under the command of George W. Bush, so you could blame George W. Bush, but Bush was a buffoon in that he was just doing what his advisors told him to do. He's not well read on all these international relations and things like that. He knew nothing about Al-Qaeda. He didn't understand the history. But the people who were advising him did. And what did they advise him to do? They advised him to play right into Al-Qaeda's hands. And these are supposed to be the wizards of smart who protect us, the people who keep us safe. It's absolutely nonsensical. I have no respect for any of these people. Nor should anyone who's well read on any of these topics. And so it's infuriating when I hear about how Trump is so desperate to find more of these people to staff the Pentagon. It really drives home what a wasted opportunity his administration has been. Trump really was a lot more promising in his rhetoric than I gave him credit for. I was way more pessimistic, I think, than I probably should have been based on what he was saying. But in terms of the results, I was pretty right about assuming that Trump was not going to be a great president. But really, looking back at his rhetoric during the campaign and the speeches he gave, he said some really good stuff. And he had Pat Buchanan in his ear. I mean, what happened to that? Does he just not talk to Pat Buchanan anymore? I mean, Pat Buchanan could reel off a list of names, if Trump really wanted, to a point who would actually, help try and de-escalate the wars and bring the troops home and stop all of this, global hegemony nonsense. And would help reorient the position of the Defense Department away from trying to rule the world and towards actually trying to protect Americans. Because, as I've said before, as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of course, a body of the Pentagon, who said that terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. Essentially admitting that the Pentagon's actions provoke all of these terrorist attacks that are perpetrated against civilians. Yet these people come in and they act like they're defending us from them. Now, again, it's one thing to have the position that, terrorism's a small price to pay. And if you look at it statistically, your odds of ever being killed by a terrorist are very low. There's not, other than 9/11, which again, if you leave that out, that's a pretty big thing to leave out. But even with 9/11 included, it's not that big of a problem. It's something that terrorizes people, though. That's the point of terrorism. It's supposed to be a lot scarier than what it actually is. But the Pentagon isn't honestly coming out and making that argument and saying, yeah, terrorism is a small problem, and what we're doing is more important. No, they say that to themselves behind closed doors, and then in the front they say, oh, well, you need us to protect you from the terrorists. You need to give us all of your cell phone data, and you need to let the NSA spy on you so that we, the Defense Department, then can go drone bomb your house if you're thinking wrong think. Yeah, so I'm pretty happy to see that the Pentagon is dysfunctional, in the words of Senator Jack Reed, and being hollowed out. I hope that means that they'll be more ineffectual and impotent. However, that probably isn't the case, because so much of the horrible things that they do are already set in motion that you don't really need the bureaucrats to implement them. You still have all of these overseas contingency operations, as they're called within the budget, also known as wars that are unapproved by Congress, going on in the background. And, you don't need bureaucrats to implement that. You only need bureaucrats to plan out where the new wars are going to be. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.